The lecture today is Attachment Across the Lifespan. We're going to talk about a basic attachment theory, including Bowlby and Ainsworth, who are the original theorists of attachment theory, and attachment orientations, as well as adult attachment and the model of self and others. If you bring this into a large screen, this little movie, it's going to be a bit fuzzy. We are working on that, but for the moment, so that we can get the information to you, I'm going to go ahead and just continue with this PowerPoint. John Bowlby was born in 1907 in London, England, and to an upper middle class family. His father was a surgeon in the king's household, and at the time, families of prominence, which his obviously was, tended to believe that affection spoiled children, and they tended to not really participate in the raising of their children. So Bowlby was raised by nannies. He had 6 other siblings, and when he talks about his early childhood, he specifically talks about how much he loved his nanny, who actually left the family when John was 4 years old. So that gives you a little bit of information on his early childhood. He said when the nanny left, it was like losing a mother. He was traumatized by the experience. He only saw his mother once a week for an hour after tea time. The rest of the time, he was with his nanny, and he very rarely, from what I can find, ever talked about his siblings. So that makes me kind of curious as to where his siblings ended up. At 7, which was appropriate for the time, he was sent to boarding school. Now, you also have to remember, this is the same time that Freud was doing some of his work, and then toward the end of the Victorian era. So very repressed society, very specific rule-bound society, not a lot of emotions. And this culture that he was expected to maintain definitely affected him the rest of his life. He went to the University of Cambridge for medicine. His father said that, this would be a good thing. I'm a doctor, you're a doctor, you should go to medical school. But he did not like it at all. He was much more interested in developmental psychology, what would now be termed developmental psychology. So he abandoned his medical career, got a degree in psychology, and after graduated, he began doing some volunteer work. He volunteered in a residential institution which worked with 24 children that were considered maladjusted at the time. He volunteered to a couple of different agencies, but this one in particular was very influential. He observed the children and how they behaved with each other and how they behaved around other people. And then he, of course, had histories as much as they could of the children and what had happened and what their family life was like. And he realized that the children, the experiences that they had as young children affected who they were. And they had several children that would have very anger behaviors and things like that. He also had a child that would follow him around wherever he went, was called John Shadow. And so he really was affected by this because this child basically bonded or attached, is really what we're talking about, with him. At the same time, he met John Alford. Now, John Alford became influential in Bowlby's life because they would sit around and have conversations and debate the things that they were seeing with the children. They would talk about whether or not these family experiences were important and what influence they really did have, and what influences in the area did they have with treatment for these children. And so within this framework of all of these observations that he's doing for his family, his volunteer work, he realized that family experiences had a huge impact on these children and their behavior and how they experienced relationships. And he decided he really wanted to become a child psychiatrist. Alfred really influenced this because he noted that Bowlby was a scientist at heart, and that becoming a psychiatrist, he really would have more influence over other professions and over also the medical profession. And he also realized that Bowlby was very smart, and he really needed to continue his education. So he talked to Bowlby and convinced him to go back to medical school to become a child psychiatrist, which was the only way to become a psychiatrist, and still is, to go to medical school. So reluctantly, and very reluctantly, he went back to medical school. At the same time, Bowlby was accepted into the British Psychoanalytic Society as a student candidate, which was a high honor. And he realized that that was what was going to help him get through medical school, was having a separate outlet. So he actually had double training. He was trained in medical school and was also trained in psychoanalysis. And of course, as you know, anyone that is a psychoanalyst has to go through analysis themselves. And so he did do that, and did talk about some of his early childhood experience, how they affected him at the time. Bowlby's work and Bowlby's research and theory were influenced by social workers that he worked with at various institutions, economists that he actually lived with. After dinner, they would sit around and they would discuss Freud's theory, and they would discuss what they believed worked and didn't work. And because the economists were interested in learning this, they really would put Bowlby on the spot and ask him questions and really make him think. And one of the things that he later said was that having the social workers question him and having the economists question him made a huge impact, not only on his understanding of psychoanalysis, but also on his eventual rejection of it. Ethology also influenced attachment theory. Ethology, okay, was the study of animal behavior, specifically imprinting, things like that. There was also Harlow and many other people doing some research on monkeys and behavior and relationships in monkeys that they noticed had similarities to humans. Now, when Bowlby utilized the ethology research, he was frowned upon because at the time the idea that humans and monkeys had anything in common was a horror. And so he actually risked his own reputation, but he did that several times. It turned out that he was right. But at the time, he was criticized tremendously, even by close friends. Cybernetics is the study of feedback or communication and control in living organisms, machines, and organizations. It utilizes a lot of math and technology, and so he during the Industrial Revolution, so he was really up on what was happening not only in his field but in other fields as well. Of course, developmental psychology and psychoanalysis also influenced attachment theory. He did disagree with psychoanalysis, which you didn't do back then. He actually disagreed with Freud and wrote several papers and actually spoke at psychoanalytic conventions stating that Freud was incorrect. He said that Freudians tend to go about learning about humans as an end product backwards, which means they wanted to learn about children, so instead of observing children, they talked to adults. When they talked to adults and had the adults think about their early childhood experiences, that's how Freud came about his theory. That didn't make any sense to Bowlby. Bowlby really believed that observations of children would make a whole lot more sense. And Erikson was also doing some work at the time, and Erikson also agreed with him. So he did have a few people on his side in that sense. But in general, Bowlby was pretty much out on his own. He said that psychoanalysis also had too much emphasis on child's fantasy world, that the actual life events, especially in a family with parents, were much more important than what the children were fantasizing about. He also started talking about the intergenerational transmission of relationships. In other words, the type of relationship that you had with your parents is the type of relationship they had with their parents, and so on and so on. Excuse me. Also, he really stated that Freud was wrong in a lot of ways. Remember, this is the Victorian era. Children, too much love spoils babies and spoils children. And Bowlby said that Freud was absolutely wrong in that aspect. And this is very important because Bowlby's going against a generation here and an entire culture. Freud said that babies can have too much love, that if you love babies too much or are too affectionate with them, that it's actually a negative thing. It's bad. It hurts them. And Bowlby said that that's not correct, that babies cannot have too much love, that you cannot spoil a baby by loving the baby. You spoil a baby by giving the baby things, maybe that it doesn't need, or always saying yes to it and not setting boundaries, but you cannot spoil a baby by loving it and hugging it. And that really is the basis of what is the attachment theory. And if you think back on Bowlby's childhood, that makes a lot of sense because his mother did not show him any affection and did not give him a lot of love. He very rarely saw her, and the only person that did was yanked from him. I mean, from a child experience he was abandoned by. So it makes a lot of sense that he would say that, and also from his observations of mothers and children. He observed mothers who were affectionate with their children and how they behaved, and said that they actually were more secure in themselves as people. Bowlby, after college, enlisted in the military for World War II, and during this time he actually met a lot of other psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers. So after the war, many of the people that he met started the Tavistock Clinic and Institute of Human Relations, and he headed the children's department. Because of his understanding of the influence of parents and family on children, he renamed the children's department the Department of Children and Parents to include that aspect, because we know that the parents had such an influential aspect on the children, and he wanted to specifically state that. Most of the clinicians in the department were not supportive of what their boss was doing, and his understanding of family relationships, and his statement that parents are incredibly influential on a child. So he had a hard time doing any research at Tavistock around his theory and his interests, because he was running the place and he had all of this other work to do, and so he knew he had to hire researchers to help him. Well, these other researchers, the clinicians, were not going to help him. So he began his own research unit separate of the Tavistock Clinic. He also, one of the interesting things about Bowlby is that he enjoyed research and clinical work, and today that doesn't seem like such a big deal. But back then, you were either a researcher or a clinician, and the clinicians were suspicious of the researchers because researchers don't know what it's like in the real world, and the researchers were suspicious of the clinicians because the clinicians didn't have anything to back them up as to what they were doing and why they were doing it. So there was constantly this give and take with him, because he enjoyed both aspects, and he often had to walk a fine line because of that. Well, he was able to obtain research funds to study mother and child separation. And again, this makes a lot of sense because one of the most difficult times in his life that he ever remembers was when his nanny, his mother figure, was separated from him. So he hired James Robertson to observe young hospitalized children. At the time that they did this, in the early 50s, when children went to the hospital, they were, and this is in England, and I'm not honestly sure what it was like in the United States at the time, but in England, when children went into the hospital, they were taken from their parents the moment they entered the hospital. They were put in a sterile environment. They had many, many different nurses, so they didn't have one particular caregiver. They pretty much were stuck in the bed and left there and ignored. If they had an operation, they had an operation. Nobody explained anything to the children. Children weren't considered having feelings. It wasn't very important to talk to them and deal with them. And so James Robertson went in and observed these children, and he was so moved and so frustrated and angry by the way these children were being treated. They were basically being drugged to keep them quiet. If they made noise, they were considered behavior problems. He was unable to just sit back and observe after a while. He just said, I can't do this. We've got to make some change. So he and Bowlby decided that they would make a movie that would hopefully influence other people and also show from the child's point of view what this hospital visit was really like. So Robertson had a handheld camera and his and Bowlby's own money, and they created a movie, A 2-Year-Old Goes to the Hospital, that follows a young child as the child is taken away from the mother, goes through the entire process, and then given back to the mother, and shows the differences in the child before and after. The child was very mistrustful of the mother, had a lot of difficulties with the mother, and behavior issues later, and things like that. This movie changed how children were treated in hospitals, literally overnight. Within a few years, children were allowed to have their parents stay with them in hospitals. They were allowed to have their snuggly teddy bear with them. They were allowed to walk around. They were treated very, very differently. And the other thing that this movie did, which is very important as far as Bowlby is concerned. So, James got what he wanted, which was to change things, and Bowlby got what he wanted, which was that this movie showed that attachment theory really does exist, because it showed the child before and after a major separation, a traumatic event. And the other thing that Bowlby continued to do was write for the World Health Organization. He had a grant to write about the fate of homeless children in post-war Europe. And he wrote something called Maternal Care and Mental Health, which really began the basis of his attachment work. And he continued to write his entire life. I'm going to go ahead and talk to you a little bit about actual attachment theory now and what he found in a lot of his research. You have to realize he had his own research clinic for a very long time and hired many, many researchers, and really never stopped learning, continuously questioned what he was doing, continuously revised his work based on research that he was doing, but that people all over the world were doing, which was very different than what a lot of theorists at the time. He was very open-minded and willing to change his theory when something else came to light. Attachment theory is a 4-stage biological process with observable behaviors resulting in an emotional bond between an infant and a primary caregiver. Meaning, it has 4 pretty obvious discernible stages, and you can tell where a child is in the stage based on the behaviors that the child exhibits. Attachment produces an emotional bond between the infant and the parent or the primary caregiver, usually the mother, but not always. Biological means we're born with it. Bowlby believed that the attachment process, he also read a lot of Darwin too, so the attachment process actually came about as a way of the species surviving. So for example, if there was a child in a tribe and several people were taking care of the child, when something came and threatened them, like a leopard or a cave lion or whatever, everybody could think that everybody else was taking care of the child, and the child could be left there to be eaten. Or the child could wander off and fall off a cliff, and nobody would notice, because everybody would think everybody else was taking care of the child. So what happened was, if there was one particular person to take care of the child, then that person would say, "Oh, where's my child?" And they would be much more protective of the child. And additionally, the child would have one particular person to go to when they felt threatened or scared. So it's a survival of the species. So it is biological in that it's ingrained in us. From birth, we begin the attachment process, and actually before birth we begin the attachment process. Attachment, the term attachment is from the point of view of the child, so from the child to the adult. Bonding is what a parent does with a child. Attaching is what the child does with the adult. So I wanted to make it a little bit clear. So the mom is bonding, okay? The mom is bonding, and the child is attaching. And there's a big difference there. Okay? All right, so this relationship provides a secure base for exploring. Like I said, so the child could kind of explore, but also come back if it got scared or nervous or felt threatened, and also a sense of safety because the parent would know where the child was, and hopefully provide a safe environment. We're assuming that that happens. That doesn't always happen, obviously. This relationship with the primary caregiver determines how the infant will view him or herself and how the infant views others. In other words, I'm well taken care of. When I need something, I get it. When I'm hungry, I get fed. When I'm upset or hurt, I get comforted. So I must be worth really taking care of. Or I'm hungry all the time, my diaper doesn't get changed, I'm not taken care of, I'm in pain, nobody's helping me, must not be worth loving. And as far as the view of others is concerned, I am noticing that people are helpful to me, they provide my needs, they comfort me, so they are trustful. I can trust others. They're worth trusting. Or sometimes somebody comes when I cry, sometimes somebody doesn't, sometimes I'm really hungry for a long time, sometimes I get fed, sometimes I don't. I'm not really so sure that those people are taking very good care of me. I can't trust them to do what they need to do to take care of me. So there's this dichotomy between self and others. And the one thing that we know is attachment, the behaviors and patterns are set in early childhood, but depending on life circumstances, those attachment orientations and behaviors can change. And Bowlby did say that in his theory. I'm going to go ahead and stop. This is part 1. Please go ahead and pick up with part 2, and we'll start with the stages of attachment.